Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode number 6 of the Mongoose podcast. Today, I'm joined by Frédéric, or longer form being... Actually, could you... what's your full YouTube channel name so people can know who you are?
Frédéric Voltaire Bastiat.
Yes, and he described himself as a classical liberal in the Jeffersonian tradition. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, so how are you doing today? Thank you for coming on.
Woke up and today is Thomas Jefferson's birthday and a Good Friday for me.
Oh, okay. Good Friday.
Well, today's just been a good day.
Oh, yeah, like Good Friday was a couple weeks ago. But yeah, so I could describe. So, how would you then, a bit more in depth, describe your political philosophy?
Let's see. I describe myself as a classical liberal, as Fritz put it. I believe in a aristocratic republic as a form of government. I believe in a natural aristocracy, well, basically meritocracy, essentially.
Mm.
And also, I have very strong Austro-libertarian leanings. Like, I was very influenced by Hans Hoppe, the libertarian philosopher, the anarcho-capitalist philosopher.
Okay. And so, in a way, you sort of like want the ideal republic that maybe Jefferson envisioned, of the sort of led by the gentleman farmers in like Virginia.
It's more like the elite of this character. Like, he spoke of a natural aristocracy, that it's these group of people, these group of intellectual are virtuous people, that they'd be governed by wisdom, as Jefferson would put it.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I would say, why are you a classical liberal then? If I could ask, what led you to believe that this is a political philosophy that you think would be the best to implement in a society like the United States, or in any country, I suppose?
Well, let's see. Well, I'm an American.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not too fond of monarchy that much, because I think it's not part of the American culture DNA. I think Americans are more bred of a Republican government, and as far as I can tell, this has been the best form of government. But I am fully aware of the dangers of democracy and other things as well.
All right, and people are thinking you're an atheist, though. Somebody says you're a Freemason. Somebody says this. I love this. We've got ourselves a Newtonian atheist idolater level 36 Freemason here.
I'm not an atheist. I'm a Christian.
Okay. Yeah, and that's something that I would genuinely say that's good on you. I don't want to be patronizing, but so often the people that claim to be like classical liberals, the people like Sargon, they're atheists, and it's like, so they really have no actual way to justify their system morally. Whereas, like, even though they weren't explicitly Christian, many of the founding fathers, at the very least, they believed in God, or in some God, that, and from which a natural law, or which in part of which a natural law that entailed people's rights, their natural rights, came from God. And so there's actually some sort of, basis supporting a classical liberal system, even though I still wouldn't call myself a classical liberal, and in fact would be quite critical of even the vision of the founding fathers, and the fact that I think it almost, to me, seems like a bit of a time bomb that the deeply Christian society that the founding fathers established, or that already existed in America circa the late 18th century, although the secular government was pretty much fine so long as America was a deeply Christian country, and so long as 99% of the population were Christians, the problem is it had no way of addressing what happens once you get a perfectly accepted social changes, as happened in the mid 20th century, when all the Christian morality disappeared, and now it seems that the classical liberal values existing in the countries like the U.S., Canada, and the U.K. are rapidly deteriorating.
Yeah, Yeah, this creeping nihilism. Just I think this is one of the failures of classical liberalism because they never did really address that type of that type of they didn't really address that type of society. How will they keep their society virtuous?
And I think that's sort of the core problem for me, because for many, I sort of classify American conservatives and British liberals. Like, so Ben Shapiro and Sargon are both liberals, but Ben Shapiro, even though he's not Christian, he's Jewish. He believes in God, and he's sort of he's a classical liberal in the American sense, and Sargon's one in the secular modern sense. The problem for both of them, of course, is that I think holding individual liberty as the highest value of society, it doesn't really make sense to me, nor do I think it's sustainable in the long run. Because for me, individual liberty is a means to an end, not an end in itself. If you make men free, okay, what are they supposed to do with their freedom? There's no way to say, okay, you're free to do whatever you want. Well, what do I do with my life? Well, we can't tell you that now. Okay. And seems like people begin to start questioning any of these. Once people start questioning the moral, and social mores of their society, they start saying, well, if freedom's the most important value, then why don't I just do whatever makes me feel as good as possible? And that's in some ways how you get the hedonism and consumerism of today.
Yeah, just I think religion can impose a form of self-government on people. I think some type of traditionalism can really help to give people a purpose.
Go ahead.
It's like I'm not really particularly fond of like state enforced religion. I think it just kind of needs to be voluntary in a way.
Well, in a way, I've noticed this is that the countries that are there's even the joke by the new atheist Stephen Fry when he says, like, apparently for atheism to be, atheism is stronger when you have a state church, because if you look at the state churches, like the state Lutheran churches in Germany and Scandinavia and the Church of England, they're completely and totally, they have absolutely zero teeth, and they basically are only a couple years behind wherever the rest of the secular society and culture is, to the point where I can't even really consider them Christian churches anymore. Whereas if you look at like the Southern Baptists and evangelicals and the Catholic Church, which have always been, even the Catholic Church, the influence it's had, it's always been explicitly separate from any state government. No government owns the Catholic Church, and they have been the most resistant towards any sort of modernity or any sort of secular encroachments on religion. Because when it comes to religion and the church and state, I really don't care about limiting religious influence on society or the state. I want churches and Christianity to deeply influence as much of our culture and government as possible. It's more the other way around. I don't want the state dictating what the church is allowed to do. And essentially that is something that medieval Europe seemed to have, where although there was clear separation of the certain powers that the secular kings in Europe and the church had, it was still understood that Europe was Christendom, was a explicitly Catholic, civilization. And it had that without the Catholic Church being like an enforced state church, as it would be like in Anglicanism or Lutheranism.
Yeah. Just for Americans in religion, in Alexis, I can never pronounce his name, Alexis de Tocqueville.
Yeah, Alexis de Tocqueville, yeah.
And Democracy in America, he did know that Americans was able to conflate liberty with Christianity, but just that I think that statement is true today, that I don't think most Americans cannot imagine Christianity out in their country, out being a part of their influence of their culture. And
I think increasingly the people living in this country could they really be considered Americans? I'm not just talking about immigration. I'm talking about just the fact that so many of, modern Americans just have no respect, it seems, for any of the values that their ancestors had in America. You know, it's like it's not in the sense that the West's problem is not the influence of foreign cultures. It's the fact that we're like this first civilization that has an anti-culture. We're the whole self-hating, the whole Western civilization's evil white privilege thing. It seems like the progressives have essentially succeeded in creating what can be called anti-culture.
I think one of America. I think America is a unique case because I think it's like it's just basically an experiment in the middle class, just giving the middle class the rule, or supposedly that they rule themselves. And if you read books like Coming Apart by Charles Murray, like there's just been like a very strong decline since the 1960s. Like the decline of marriage, the decline of family. And since I'm Black, this is even.
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to leave the stream now. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Yes, since I'm Black, and this is sort of accelerating in my community. You know, Black people are way more socially conservative than Black people on paper.
I mean, you even read stuff by Thomas Sowell that, and I not to go on a tangent for a moment, but I think it needs to be said that on this subject, the alt-right probably would have very different opinions about the African-American community if the African-American community had the same values it did in 1940, where actually, I think Thomas Sowell said in 1929, the Black unemployment rate was lower than the white one. You know, like the Harlem Renaissance, the African-American communities, like certainly there was a lot of issues in them, but I think you could probably attest to this, not to the same level as today, because at least then the family was still intact.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of one of the sad things about the civil rights movement, where unfortunately it seems like the genuine good reforms of granting legal equality and ending formal segregation, it seemed like it became lumped in, though, with the other social changes like the sexual revolution predominantly, wherein any of the benefits given, any of the good that was done by the civil rights movement was completely canceled out by the fact that you had the destruction of the traditional family.
Yeah, I kind of have like a negative view on people like Martin Luther King and other leaders in the civil rights movement, because I kind of just view them as crypto communists, to be honest.
Wow. Oh, I thought for a second. So, would you say the same thing about Malcolm X, though?
Not really. He actually was more beneficial in the Black community.
I always find that interesting that there does seem to be a lot of. I've seen a lot of African Americans, like even ones that are fairly conservative, say that they're not the biggest fans of MLK, but actually liked Malcolm X more, even though wasn't Malcolm X half white?
Hey, don't look. Don't look into it. Just don't look into it. Everybody got messed up family trees in the Black community.
Yeah. I think I always find it interesting. It seems to be something that is common of no matter what color you are, if you have any Native American blood in it, you think you're magic.
That's like a crypto communist. I think that has some validity to it.
But I think going back to classical liberalism, I think the question I would ask any American conservative is, they'll agree that this is something that happened in the mid-20th century, and they would agree that it's bad. I would ask them, well, why did it happen?
Well, let's see. Libertarianism, I guess the first real philosopher that was able to secularize libertarianism was Murray and Rothbard. Like he just basically took God. He basically took God out of the equation, just leaving this is the system. And this is and I think it's just sort of brought out the current state of libertarianism, honestly. So,
I mean, this is a sad thing because I'm actually still, I was a much bigger fan years earlier, but still sort of a fairly big fan of Ron Paul. And it's, if Ron Paul type libertarianism, if the libertarianism of actual, like going back to a framework of a strict interpretation of the Constitution, I might have disagreements with it, but at least it's coherent and it's not completely insane like modern libertarianism is, where you have the Libertarian National Convention, where you have a guy like starts like a big fat guy stripped down to his underwear and start dancing around.
actually,
Or a
I
guy,
know the story behind that. Like,
oh really?
I actually have some respect for the guy because the reason why he did that, because the Libertarian Party are a bunch of fraudsters. They're leftists, progressives, datists, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I got some respect for that guy. That's why he kind of did that.
Just to make, so he was just really trying to turn the whole thing into a farce and bring the whole thing down.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I could see that. Still ridiculous. Or when I think I can't remember when Austin Peterson, I think it was, said like, I don't think we need to, like, yeah, I'm for legalization of drugs, but I don't think we should be selling cocaine to children. And people booed him for saying that, for even saying that we shouldn't legalize selling hardcore drugs to children. People said, well, that's too oppressive.
Ooh, that sounds like peak ghetto ethics.
But I mean, my problem with libertarianism is the fact that it's just this mass obsession with liberty, the idea of liberty itself, wherein, again, as I would say, my belief, or I think one of the things that forms traditionalism is, in my definition, is it's the belief that morality should be the highest value of a society, that we shouldn't be striving for a free society, we should be striving for a moral, for a good society. And I believe that out of that will come a relatively high degree of individual freedom, because as I see it, the way a lot of classical liberals would have described it is, well, we already, the American Revolution's not fought to establish new rights, but to reassert the rights that we already possess as Englishmen, because the English would always say, well, we have our concept of limited government going all the way back to the Magna Carta, and it's based on that tradition that we want these liberal principles, not because we want to change everything. Like that was, I think, arguably the problem in France, where they completely wanted to do away with the entire system, whereas after the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, in the late 17th century, was more to stop having a crypto-Catholic a monarch trying to assert full control over England, and trying to finally end a century of vacillating between absolutist Catholic monarchs and puritanical Republican dictatorships under Cromwell. And then, of course, the American one was to reassert the rights that they felt were being denied by them. The problem, though, is I think what you say then about countries that don't really have that tradition of centuries of tradition of liberalism, like you could see that happened in Germany, wherein, although Germany itself did have, Germany's liberalism in the 19th century was substantially different, in my view, than in the Anglo-speaking world, because German liberalism was very tied in with German nationalism and desiring a unified Germany along the lines of a constitutional empire, harkening back, trying to go back to mixing the Holy Roman Empire and the UK. But even then, obviously, we could see, as happened in Germany after World War I, they didn't really take to classical liberalism too well, did they?
Yeah, just rather sad that World War I really brought out the end of monarchy, aristocratic rule in Europe, and brought out the horrors of democracy, to be honest.
And I mean, this is the thing, is I'm not necessarily against republics themselves. It's more against the whole ideology of the thing that just like gets me so angry about people like Woodrow Wilson and George Clemenceau and David Lloyd George. It's this sort of pathological assertion of, we need to destroy this country's government and force them to become democratic for the sake of the world. And they essentially justified murdering and starving millions of innocent people to death just so they could, and prolong the war several more months just so that the Germans would revolt against their own government. Like the Germans in 1917 and 1918 were very much willing to sue for a favorable and even peace, but the Allies, at that point, the Allies were the ones who continuously refused any peace treaty because they wanted to completely destroy the German government because, well, quote, it wasn't a liberal democracy. And I think if you want to go a little more, I wouldn't even say this is a conspiracy theory because it's pretty, I think there's plenty of evidence for it, that it was so that American bankers who had been investing and giving loans to the Allies would actually make back their money.
Oh, the merchant of death thesis? Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Also, but democracy is peaceful, though.
When has it ever spread to another country peacefully? When?
I don't know. Ask the dead men who thought that was a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that's sort of my problem with neoconservatives, to be honest, that they just think democracy is just this wonderful thing that it should be spread all over the world when it's, well, kind of garbage, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I find your position then interesting. That so you would still say that you're in favor of generally a high amount of individual liberty, right?
Right.
And then, but under essentially a pseudo aristocratic republic, or not a pseudo, just an aristocratic republic, which I find fascinating. That, and again, I don't want to bring this into it, but interesting that you're African American and yet you're very much a fan of Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner.
Why would I care about that?
Exactly. I think I just find it a little interesting. But you're right. If you like his ideas, you like his ideas. I mean, where I'm going on this is, or actually, do you have anything else, Dad?
I like this disputes on misconceptions about Jefferson. Like, he wasn't Rousseauian or Hobbesian in any sense, that he didn't really believe in, well, like he didn't really believe in the Rousseauian state of nature, and he had some disagreement with Thomas Hobbes. Like, I think his state of nature is more about Stoicism, that the state, it was more the state of nature, his natural law theory, it was more about Stoicism, if anything else. I find that pretty interesting.
I mean, I find it interesting. I like thinking about it from my perspective, because the philosopher I've been very much influenced of late is Hegel. And to me, in a lot of ways, he seems to turn a lot of these classical liberals completely on their head. Like, there's just something about, regardless of what people think about them, these radical German philosophers like Hegel and Nietzsche, like, they seem to throw a gigantic wrench into the philosophical workings of the classical liberals. Like this, it's just like this almost like, let's deconstruct everything and strip away everything. What are you going to do now, classical liberals?
Ooh, Hegel. What did he want? Did he want like a monarchy? Or
Hegel essentially was, he essentially didn't really advocate a specific type of government. He was or like a specific ideology. He was more just trying to understand explaining how history can be explained through dialectic and spirit. That the history is sort of its history is the process of disseminating idea against idea, thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. In his time, circa the early 19th century, he believed that the Kingdom of Prussia was the most advanced state at the time, that it had essentially it was the most efficient and best way to govern society at the time. Of course, I will admit, he probably, one of the reasons he might have been encouraged to say that was the fact that he was, a chair at the University of Berlin, a state-run university by the Prussian government. But I think, for me, what he seems to understand things a little more broadly than I think a lot of the classical liberal philosophers like Thomas Paine, who I sort of utterly detest, had, where it's not about this one idea about how we're going to run government. It's more about, like, because again, governments are appropriate and applicable to different types of societies. Where, as you said, like certain countries, like America, you would say, are much more they are much more amenable to republics than they would be a monarchy, and that different types of governments are better for different times. I think Hegel would have said that essentially what's more important is the dissemination and history of ideas and how they form and shape history.
Interesting.
Someone says that they're a Nazbol. Oh dear.
Oh, I'm just thinking about government now. I think government is more of a representative of what people think. I think what people think, what the proper just government is. I think that's the thing. I think government is more often than not like more of a reflection of human nature, if anything else.
I mean, I think Ulysses S. Grant had a quote that I think there's probably a lot of truth to, that every country has every country, it's every country has the government it deserves, and essentially, and that more or less the society of an area of the structure and culture and all that of a society is going to either explicitly create the government that forms it, or at the very least be very influential. Like even when you have foreign conquests, like when the Mongols invaded, the steppes of Central Asia, which were predominantly Muslim, they didn't completely change the culture of of the steppes. Rather, most of these Khans, like in what would form the Golden Horde, basically just became Muslim and adopted that culture. And same thing in China, when you had either the Mongol conquest of China or the Qing dynasty by the Manchus, who were also a nomadic people in northeast China today. They essentially adopted the culture around them. So saying that more often than not, it seems the culture forms the government more than the other way around. Although I would say today, with technology and the development of a centralized bureaucratic state, that can change a little bit. Like Nazi Germany and Soviet Union absolutely were shaping the culture around them by just mass use of propaganda and having totalitarian governments.
Yeah. Let's see. Also, you mentioned, why do you despise Thomas Paine anyway?
Well, I read his first off because I think he was completely wrong about human. I think he was completely wrong about human nature. I think he seems like he took a much more Rousseauian approach, and also just his vehement, ardent anti-Christian rhetoric, especially in books like The Age of Reason, which is, it's like it forms the basis for the new atheist. If you've read Thomas Paine, and you listen, anything like Christopher Hitchens or any of the new atheists are going to say, because it's a horrible, horrible essay where it's just any bit of the Bible that he thinks that he slightly gets confused by, he says, well, this is just proof that the entirety of the Bible and Christianity is wrong and terrible. And it's like, even the other founding fathers hated him as well. Like, I think there was like a number, I know John Adams, and I think also Ben Franklin and a number of others wrote like direct criticisms and direct like responses to The Age of Reason, and only 6 people attended to his funeral because of how outspokenly anti-Christian he was.
Oh, I guess Mercer Struggle was right to call Thomas Paine a cunt.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's, and even the fact that like he was cheering on the, stripping away of rights. He was an ardent supporter of the French Revolution and was ardently, supporting the stripping away of like Catholic priests' rights in France, where it's like, okay, so, you're supposed to be a champion of freedom, but you seem to be like dancing with glee as Catholic priests in France are being arrested, forcibly, secularized, imprisoned, and deported, and ultimately a large number of them were executed.
Yeah, this is where I sort of part ways on Jefferson on the French Revolution. Also, I think Jefferson was somewhat fond with Thomas Paine, or
I mean, this is the thing. I think one thing you have to say about both the Enlightenment thinkers and the Founding Fathers is that they're not one blob. Like, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were vehemently, were sort of famous for being ideological enemies of each other.
Well, they're pretty good friends at the same time.
Yeah, but in terms of ideas, like, there's a big range in terms of like the religious beliefs, and Jefferson's more on the deism side, and then George Washington and John Adams on the actual Christian side.
Yeah.
And even that the difference in political beliefs sort of formed the basis for, I think, wasn't it Jefferson formed either the Anti-Federalists or the Democratic Republicans, and John Adams forming the Federalists.
Anti-Federalists. Jefferson and John Adams.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the miniseries of John Adams?
I saw a bits and piece of it.
It's really good. It was really good.
Hopefully someday I will watch the whole thing.
But even then, I think, and I think the question I'd ask, because John Adams even put it rightly, and I think he said something similar to what Edmund Burke said. Edmund Burke said, liberty doesn't exist in the absence of morality. And John Adams said, our Constitution was explicitly meant for a moral and religious people. And the question I think, if I'm going to grill the classical liberals on, is if morality is necessary for a liberal society to exist, how do you form a more moral society and yet still, do you think any amount of individual liberty is going to have to be sacrificed in order to keep some of it, in order for us to have a more moral society? Or is there a way you can do it without any sort of coercion?
Well, I think they kind of need to pull a Hayek here, saying that coercion is not really like an initiation of force, that kind of thing.
Like what?
Like Hayek, F.A. Hayek, he was also a Catholic.
Yeah, he was the Austrian. He was famous for opposing. I'm actually sort of a fan of Hayek for opposing Keynesianism.
Oh, right, Keynes. Not on his degeneracy, but on Hayek though. I think Hayek was one of the early fusionists, like libertarianism and traditionalism. I think they sort of need to reconcile that.
And I think ultimately, like, the question is, because I actually believe me wanting to advance traditionalism or reactionary thought is not something I want to do through the state initially. It's something that I think has to be done culturally by, possessing certain institutions. But for me, it's sort of this mindset that it's putting things into a correct, I guess, order in terms of priorities. Is that if you need a moral society for a liberal society, why is liberty still the predominant value that classical liberals hold, even if they agree that morality has to come first in order for there to be liberty?
Let's see. I think classical liberals were right to identify that freedom of the individual was a good start. A good starting point. But later on, I think the main problem is that they focus on the individual too much. That the much earlier classical liberal thinkers focus ideas on the family and the community. But now, since we live in an age of hyper individualism and consumerism, that's sort of breaking down the community, the family, and anything else. Like, we just live in, this is basically, in other words, decadence that sort of just brought this social order down.
And I think, again, that's the question is, even if you're going to say, and I think this is where I part with the American conservative classical liberals, like Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, all of that, is, okay, they understand at the very least that, and will agree, you need to have morality in order to have a free society, but they will still prioritize liberty over having a moral society, to the point where most of American conservatives are just completely are increasingly okay with any sort of moral degeneracy or moral breakdown. Because when was the last time you heard a American conservative speak out against gay marriage or divorce? The only moral issue that they still seem to be holding on any ground on is abortion. And yet, because I'm thinking in 5 years, you're going to, at the next Republican convention or whenever it is, I would be surprised if we didn't see a transgender person come on stage and say, yes, I'm transgender, but I'm also conservative. And that means I believe in limited government and a strong military, even though I don't know how that works, and low taxes. I'm like, that sounds pathetic and stupid. It sounds soulless to me.
Hey, that's peak boomer conservative for you.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I mean, this is why I would advocate for, and why I distance myself from classical liberalism, because I don't think you can have liberty as the highest value and have a free society in the end, because liberty proceeds from morality. And so I think if we want to have a society that has a high level of individual freedom, we should understand, why is it that Western European Christian societies were the ones, even first, had centuries of tradition laid down for there to be liberal societies? Because even in the Middle Ages, I would probably argue that European Christians were more quote unquote free than either a lot of Europeans today or other people in other parts of the world at that time. Because if you look at it, if you're like just some farmer, let's say in Hungary in like 1300, your interaction with the government is going to be almost non-existent. You're going to pay very, very few taxes. You can pretty much just do whatever you want, so long as you're not like practicing witchcraft. You just do your farm work. You're part of your local community, and you go to church. Your interaction, like even then, this is all based on our modern concept of the state, which didn't come around until essentially the 17th century, where you had, with the rise of absolutist governments like Louis XIV's France. And I'm saying is, I think we sort of, I would argue that classical liberals sort of have this understanding backwards, where, we need a free society that's part and parcel with a moral society. But the problem is that, again, they should understand that like there were moral societies that produced what they would understand as relatively free societies that had centuries without classical liberalism, that you had people that would have been deeply moral and in a lot of ways free in medieval Europe. And in part, I think it's sort of this sort of, I know now because I've essentially become a traitor to the Protestant cause, but it's sort of that narrative that the big bad Catholic Church oppressed everybody for 1,000 years. But when I look at history, I don't really see that happening, or at least anywhere near the extent that a lot of the alarmists like the Founding Fathers would have said. Sorry, I have a very squeaky chair.
They seem like it needs to have certain preconditions that liberalism needs to enter any type of free society, as you put it.
Mm-hmm. And that's, again, I guess I'm sort of pushing this, is, would you still then consider liberty being the highest value? Or do you think that actually, in order for a free society, in order for people that want to value a free society, they ought to actually shift their priorities towards morality rather than liberty first?
Honestly, I would not know. I think that I should say morality and liberty should be fused together, to be honest. I think classical liberals were able to create that fusion, that one cannot live without the other. And now that's gone. Now that fusion has been broken down. I think we're just seeing this totally degenerate society that we're living in right now.
I mean, I think I can sort of see that, because the way I see it, if the classical liberal movement in the late 18th and early 19th century, if it was just a way of clarifying or more refining or specifying, giving a better definition towards the moral dignity that people were already supposed to have had during the Middle and early Renaissance period, Middle Ages and Renaissance period, that, people, because a lot of this sort of comes from, rights given to us by God. I think it's a descendant in terms of ideas from the deeply Catholic Christian idea of we are all created in God's image. And, that's, to me, as somebody becoming Catholic, that's something that's always like, it seems to be very much hammered home anytime I think I talk to Catholics or hear Catholic arguments, that this dignity comes from the fact that we are, in a sense, sacred in a certain way, that we're made in God's image, that because of that we have a certain dignity, that there are certain things that we cannot do to each other, else they're, not loving each other, causing harm to each other, is in a way blasphemous, because we're hurting another human being made in God's image, and we're denying them being made in his image. And I think that's where I think a lot of these ideas for rights come from. And again, I think you see a deeply moral and religious and spiritual basis, not a sort of secular philosophical one for rights.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm just saying is that, like, I don't hate a free society. I don't want a massive, like, repressive government. I think, again, to an extent, government repression certainly has a lot of issues with it, and not least among that being the tendency towards, violating people's basic human dignity as an immoral act. But I think if classical liberals look at the society we live in now, I would argue that if they want a free society, they can't continue along the path of still trying to argue like we live in the 18th century, like we still have societies that could support classical liberalism, because at this point, I think it's very obvious we don't. That America, Britain, Canada, the West is not a society that can support classical liberalism at this point, because it does not have a moral compass. It doesn't even, because people, it's not, you imagine trying to convince people that God exists, which I think a lot of conservatives will argue is necessary to believe in rights, but trying to convince people that meaning exists when you have massively high suicide rates and people becoming school shooters and just generally increasingly sociopathic, selfish, and just wretched population living in the West. I think there needs to be a lot more work done that can't just be, we need more freedom, guys.
I just, like I said earlier, I just think it's just decadence, just sort of just breaking things down. And I just think the founding fathers will be so disgusted what the system that they created has devolved into. Like, American institutions are still pretty strong, but it's just continually getting weaker by the day.
And I mean, and again, that's the point, right? It's if I was a classical liberal, I'd really try and figure out, why did this happen? How did this happen? And what could be done? And again, the point is that I don't think that you can emphasize individual liberty as the primary goal anymore, because if you want liberty, you need morality, and we don't have morality. Go ahead.
Well, to answer your first question, I think it was the death of God in the late 19th century that sort of declared. I think that's that's one of the causes of that.
And I think it's a question that all of us, I think, in the 21st century, when all of this is culminating in us asking the questions today, and it seems so many of the problems of the 20th century culminating now in societal breakdown, is the whole fact that Nietzsche, not so much his declaration was more of a prediction that I think Western society would reject God en masse, and following the First World War. And it's this loss of meaning. It's this loss of there are things that are objectively true, good, and beautiful, and that can sort of explain moral relativism, this the moral decay, and the fact that even look at the arts, the fact that we have this idea of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and to a certain extent, if it's art in a lot of ways can be subjective, sure, but there's now this concept that anything can be art, and if anything can be art, well, nothing can be art. It's why a box of used tissues is now worth $3 million. It's and these are the questions of meaning, of recovering some sort of objective meaning that not just classical liberals but everybody, I think, we need to take seriously, because this is where a lot of these problems are coming from, is our society's acceptance of relativism over the past 100 years.
Yeah. Also, I like to move the conversation on like classical liberal theory, like the state of nature. Like,
okay, yeah, sure. And I think because at this point I've laid out my case and strongly enough, and I think repeated myself enough. I think you understand that, but yeah, I'd love to move on to that.
Yeah, what do you believe is the state of nature?
I basically believe in the Christian understanding that mankind created perfect in God's image, but by our free will, we chose to fall, and human history is. I'm very sympathetic to Hobbes. I think I don't go as far as him. I don't believe in the absolute total depravity. I do believe that humanity, it's a tragedy, but with hope in it. It's the fact that our history is very bleak, but it's dotted with good in it. That there were, and not just in religion, not just the prophets of the Old Testament, and of course culminating in the passion of Jesus Christ, but there are people that strove to be good, and that we still live, though, in a largely fallen world. And ultimately, I think that because of this, I don't think we can trust individuals with a high degree of freedom without pushing it, without it seems, as was the case in Europe, centuries after centuries of Christianity being baked very deeply into the culture. And it's something, and this actually goes along with my last video was the second part on my history of Prussia, which is, I almost argue Prussia, if Britain was one way that a Protestant country tried to develop a civilization, Prussia was the opposite, in the way that if England's philosophy was based on John Locke, or Loki, I guess, Prussia was based on Hobbes. Prussia sort of adopted Hobbes's ideology or philosophy because of the sheer hell that Brandenburg Prussia went through during the 30 Years' War. Like, you can watch the video yourself, and I have a video where I just read from the book Iron Kingdom about some of these atrocities that they were left understanding afterwards of both how do we prevent this from ever happening again, and that being in its core both foreign invasion and this sort of almost psychopathic, irrational violence that seems to be locked in mankind in a lot of ways, that causes them not just to rape and plunder, but just to murder. Like in the 30 Years' War, soldiers they strip children naked and then drown them in a river for no reason. And it's like, how can you believe human nature is inherently good when people do that? And so, long story short, I believe that Hobbes was largely right on human nature, that it is inherently flawed. But I would dial it back a little bit, that we have the capacity for good, that we don't need a complete totalitarian government to rein us in, and that ultimately we were made for good. We were made for worship of God, but by our own choice, we are deeply fallen, and that by the grace of God through Jesus Christ, we can be redeemed and become better. Is that a good enough explanation for you?
Yeah, that's a very wonderful state of nature theory.
Thank you.
I think my state of nature is that the state of nature is one of parasitism, and that
Of
man
what?
parasitism, that the state of nature is naturally parasitic, that
Okay.
human beings are more willing to lie, steal, plunder, and it takes a very long time to to get away from that, to have to form a civilized society. I
Mhm.
took it took I believe it took like a nearly 1,000 years to get away from that state of nature.
And I think, yeah, it's if you look at the history, sorry, of the West of the past, from the end of the Roman Empire to the Enlightenment, it took a very long time for Christian society to get rid of stuff like abortion and infanticide and slavery and a lot of just the really, as much as there was good in the pagan classical world, there were um, so many terrible practices. Like, say what you want about the Middle Ages, but at the very least, if you were a child in the Middle Ages, you had a much better chance of survival because at the very least, you could reliably know that your father wasn't going to leave you, on a mountainside to die because medieval man would have understood that to be a grossly horrible, awful thing to do. Whereas in the ancient world, that would have been seen as, well, it's your right as the pater familias, and it's a mercy to kill the child. Sounds familiar to something today, doesn't it?
Man, kind of reminded me of Rothbard, to be honest.
And I agree with you there that in order to sort of rein in the immorality inherent in a lot of humans in humanity, you need a large, I wouldn't say you just need a state, you need some sort of restraint through a government, but you need morality, you need spirituality and a way to guide people, because people won't choose to be good on their own. I don't think it's people are, because as social creatures and as creatures that crave culture and society are going to pull people towards one direction or another. Again, in 1950, pretty much all Americans were either Christian or Jewish, would have gone to church, and would have, most of them would not have had children out of wedlock, would have thought abortion was terrible, would have been religious. How did it? Yet it only took a couple decades for that to completely collapse. And I think, not to repeat myself, but it's because of I would say, the lack of a society that felt the need to enforce these morals.
That so just also I like to go over like other classical liberal state of natures,
Yeah, absolutely.
like Rousseau, like his famous declaration that what was it, that man is born good but everywhere in chains.
Mankind is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. I think it's like, yeah, Rousseau, the guy who like cheated on his wife constantly and abandoned his children.
Oh, that sounds like Richard Spencer.
Or Karl Marx. like yeah, Karl Marx was, in terms of, I actually watched the Stefan Molyneux video on him, and it's like, yeah, Karl Marx he was a dick. He was a terrible person.
Oh, that's this guy who read Marx. Well, at least Thomas Sowell Marxism. The guy was ironically a parasite of the working class.
Yeah, he never earned any money for himself.
Yes,
and he didn't even pay his maid.
I don't think Marx was Rousseauian in any sense.
No, I'm just saying in the sense of people that, okay, they're trying to lay out a philosophy, yet they were morally reprehensible people. I'm not asking for people to be perfect, but at the very least, like, don't be Rousseau or Karl Marx. But I haven't read enough of Rousseau. I do know that he did have a sort of conversion experience at one point where he started believing that actually, like, a lot of his own ideas were wrong, that like humanity needed God, that humanity was going to crawl back and ask like for like a strong dictator, or a strong sort of handed government again. I think he was certainly wrong about the state of nature. I think, but unfortunately, I don't know all that much about Rousseau.
Well, my profile picture, Frédéric Bastiat, the law, he wrote the law and he criticized Rousseau and felt like he contradicted himself on his view on his view of human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And also, what I heard about him, he gave his ideas of freedom is really borderline socialist.
Who, Rousseau?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like, if you watch videos of Sargon of Akkad, who criticized Sargon of Akkad, like, many of his reasoning is borderline Rousseauian. Although I think that's more a result of his environment that he lives in.
Yeah, Sargon's like the most British person. He's an embodiment of a lot of like Britishness today. Some good, some bad. But any more about Rousseau, because I don't want to just lecture you. I want you to maybe teach me and teach the listeners. Do you know anything more about Rousseau, or actually tell me more about Frederick? I've never actually heard of Bastiat.
Oh, Frédéric Bastiat, very interesting fellow.
Yes, please tell me.
He was the French classical liberal. He was a French economist. He also was a fanatic free trader. And he wrote a pamphlet called the Candlestick Petition. And basically, we need to block out the sun to protect the candlestick makers from competition. That's kind of hilarious. He was a very funny guy. And the law is like one of Ron Paul's favorite books about liberty.
Okay.
In the first very passages of the law, he said the law is the gift from God, and the God gave us faculties to accumulate capital, essentially, and essentially when the law becomes perverted, basically he was arguing against wealth redistribution. It becomes legal plunder.
So he seems like he would have been like a proto-libertarian then.
Oh yeah, actually he was, honestly.
He seems then like it seems more like than a English classical liberal than a French one.
Yeah, that's sort of like one of the more unique things about him, that he did believe in God. After all, he said he did declare that the law is the gift from God, that he gave faculties to live other things. Also, he said some rather interesting too.
I mean,
it been said that the United States kept the law in its proper domains. That if I would say the crux of Bastiat's personal philosophy, he did definitely believe in property. That was kind of his crux of his ideology.
I mean, it's something that I've thought about. And do you know the channel The Distributist?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, he doesn't like people asking about distributism, even though that's his channel name, because he doesn't think it's really applicable now. But I would say that, I mean, of all the classical liberal principles, I actually would say the one I ardently, completely, wholeheartedly agree with is that we ought to have a fundamental right to own property, to own things, because I think if I just think about the alternative of any idea where it's like, first off, I think Aristotle said like things held in common are not taken care of. Like there is a great video Sargon has on the Thinkery called Anarcho-Communism in Action, where there's a little enclave, a tiny little like abandoned military outpost in the California desert that like a couple hundred just complete deadbeats live there and live off of welfare. And it looks like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Like it's just completely filled with junk. Like everything's like people are constantly getting stolen from, and like the art there is of course just like broken bottles and like buttons, welded to a bus that doesn't even work anymore. And it's just
like peak anarchism.
It is, and it's terrible.
This
is what humans, because I'm an alien, have been trying to avoid for thousands of years. Of we don't want to do this anymore. We want a state, but it's like people owning things immediately it's interesting. I've heard like a couple arguments that one way you could solve overfishing is to privatize the oceans, because currently like the ocean fishing water, it's like, okay, you're in American fishing waters, you can essentially just fish as much as you want, and then but you don't own that fishing ground, and so you don't really care about what happens to it. And so once it's depleted, well, you just go to another place. Whereas if essentially you could like purchase like a couple square kilometers of, of ocean, you'd be like, okay, so this is mine. I want to make it so that there's a sustainable level of fish here, so I can continue to profit off of it, because I can't use anybody else's ocean. The same thing has been proposed of like save like the manatees or something like that, where like there's a good reason why cows and sheep and pigs are not endangered, because well, they're farmed and they're owned by private property. Like I think Lindy Beige, that channel, like he suggested, if we figured out a way to like convince people to start eating and farming manatees, well, we could save it, because you could just have manatee farms where they just breed lots and lots of manatees. But in that case, I'm thinking the free market in terms of ownership of private property is an incredibly good idea, and one that I would fully support.
You cannot have any real free society without any type of property rights.
Yeah, and again, looking at the society where it's like we're going to hold things in common, oh, what a nightmare they turn into.
Oh man, I don't want to live in the Soviet Union or places like Maoist China.
Mm-hmm. Even
China at all.
And the thing is, like, the Middle Ages, property was king in the Middle Ages, where it's like, or property and titles, where it's like, even in the early Middle Ages, before you essentially had the market revolution reintroduce currency into the West, because there was the breakdown of trade and flow of currency after the fall of Rome, you had kings and dukes and the aristocracy that took over. They essentially exchanged people. They had the benefit system where you would say, you have this title, you'll do this for me, and you can have this land. And that was essentially the economic system for hundreds of years, until slowly the market system started reintroducing just actual currency into the economy. People, I'm trying to say, is like the Middle Ages, people really don't like give it enough respect for the fact that it was the period from like 1080 to 1500 was not the Dark Ages. It was not cultural like regression and degeneration. No, that's when you had the great cathedrals, when you had beautiful manuscripts and great advances in metallurgy and armor happening. And again, it's part of this fact that I think a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers said, we want to completely sweep any good things that happened in the Middle Ages under the rug, because we can't take credit for that. We want to be able to skip straight from, the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, like the ancient democracy of Athens and Republic of Rome, all the way to us. We don't want to pretend. We want to pretend like anything in between, none of that ever happened, or if it did, it was all evil.
Oh, also, have you ever read Hoppe or his book Democracy: The God That Failed?
No, I've heard it is a good book though.
Very, very.
He advocates for monarchy in certain ways, doesn't he?
He's not a monarchist, but he just sort of realized that compared to democracy and monarchism, the monarchy is definitely preferable.
I think he used the expression, or used the comparison that, like, of course, in his lovely German accent, if I have if I own the house, I want to ensure and preserve it, to give it, and I want to take care of it because it's mine. I had the incentive, and I want to give it to my children. So I want to make it more valuable so my children can have more. Whereas if I rent it, well, I have the now incentive to loot and take from it as much as possible, and zero incentive to take care of it. And essentially he says that's the difference between inheriting government and elections. Like
that's pretty much one of his arguments against democracy.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking maybe that's a case against having term limits, because if you make the position more temporary, then the people occupying it have less of an incentive to actually care about what they're doing, because, well, if I'm only going to be here for 4 years, then whatever.
Well, it would be a case for like longer term limits, though.
I suppose. I mean, we don't currently. Congress doesn't have term limits, so you can have people that are, that are apparently still like a Louis Slaughter in the state of New York, where I live. Like she recently died, and she was like 80 or 90 years old. Like she was still serving for like decade after decade. But
she was a good congresswoman.
No, she's evil. She was pro-choice.
Oh.
I'm a well, I'm not concerned. I'm a right winger living in New York State. It's a nightmare.
It can't be that bad.
Well, I live in upstate New York, where a lot more conservative here. It's just the fact that anything we want is canceled out by New York City.
Oh, right.
Like if you look at most election maps, upstate New York, it's a bit mixed. But like if we were our own state, we would probably either be a swing state or a Republican state.
Yeah. Let's see.
What else? We can wrap up soon. I think this has been a good length. Anything else you want to talk about, though? Because I don't want to keep this too long.
Also, well, why are you so from the Prussian monarchy anyway?
Oh boy, everybody asks this.
Well,
no, it's a fair question. Certainly, I'm happy to answer it. It's
let me ask you like a more specific question. Can you tell me anything unique about the bureaucracy in the Prussian government? Because I heard that was very meritocratic.
Yeah, I would say this is that the reason to start off, the reason why I find Prussia so fascinating is it comes from when I read Christopher Clark's book Iron Kingdom, which is a history of Prussia, and I thought just like the intelligence and skill that the people that were governing Brandenburg and Prussia had, that Brandenburg starts out as this very small little German state, moderately sized German state, in a sandy, swampy, barren wasteland in the 1400s. And just through careful leadership, they managed to get it to grow and grow and grow until it's comprising 60% of, by the time of unification, it comprises 60% of Germany's population and land. Pretty much almost all of northern Germany. And it's like, why is it that Prussia grew that large, well as a state that was substantially richer to the south of them, directly Saxony, didn't? And it seems to me it's because they had this this incredible foresight and understanding that we can grow and we can improve upon land and develop and become more efficient. And they said, well, and because of our location with no natural defendable borders, and because of the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, we have to basically become as efficient and militarily strong as we possibly can. And they did it. And essentially for 300 years, they managed to survive and unify Germany, which nobody was able to do other than them.
Oh,
that's why I find it so interesting. Like they're certainly not the, one thing you could say is they're not the biggest cultural, they were never the biggest cultural producers. I mean, they had people, in terms of science and philosophy, they had, of course, Immanuel Kant and later Hegel. And they also had, they had, thinking science, the Humboldt brothers, Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt. But like they can't claim like being the home of Bach or Beethoven or Mozart, certainly. But I know just something about the fact that they just said, we're going to create a state from almost nothing, and considering what they built is really, I'd say, inspiring.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's see. I don't really study empires that much, so if I was to study empires, I'd probably study the Austrian Empire.
Austrian Empire is utterly fascinating. It was a fluke of history that, because the Holy Roman Empire was never able to become unified like a country like France was, because of largely the Protestant Reformation, and then fully after the 30 Years' War, Austria, which was the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor, and had the most amount of land for the longest time until Prussia defeated them in 1866. Like they're like basically stuck with, we want to be Germany, but we can't because of the Protestantism and all the major conflicts. So we're sort of just stuck with Austria, which is German, Bohemia, which had a large German population but lost mostly Czech, Slovakia, Hungary, Transylvania, and like a huge amount in like Central Europe of people that weren't German. And so eventually, once nationalism became a more prominent idea after Napoleon, literally, I think from 1848 to 1916, the only reason the empire stayed together was Franz Josef, because he just became so respected for having been on the throne for so long.
The reason why I'm somewhat interested in the Austrian Empire is because it produced like a lot of great thinkers I really like Frédéric von Mises, F.A. Hayek, basically the Austrian school of economics, essentially.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Austria is I would love to visit Austria.
Yeah.
I mean, Vienna seems like a beautiful city. Of course, it produced Mozart, who is not my favorite composer, but he undoubtedly, contributed a huge amount to the development of music.
Yeah.
I would say, yeah, empire-wise is because if we can go, is there anything else you want to ask me though about classical liberalism we can talk about?
Well, out of the founding fathers, which one you probably identify the most with?
That's a good question. I would probably say, well, I don't want to reveal my actual last name here, but I am related to one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So I guess by pure virtue of, by default, by my blood relation, that one of the signers. But of the ones that are actually known, I'd probably say John Adams.
John Adams, that's an interesting choice.
Mm-hmm. Because he seemed to be about the most conservative of them.
Oh, I guess Jefferson was probably the most libertarian out of the founding
fathers. And then, Ben Franklin was sort of, I just see him as just sort of this crazy dreamer, not in a bad way, but he was just, it's like Washington was the sort of, he was the sort of just stern paternal, he was the general. Jefferson was Jefferson was like the political radical. Franklin was the crazy scientist, and I think Adams was a lawyer. He was just the by the books conservative of the group. I think
I probably label Jefferson as more of a philosopher.
He was.
I was expecting someone like James Madison or Hamilton.
I don't know. No, fuck James. Fuck Hamilton. No national banks. I mean. Yeah, that was the best thing that Andrew Jackson did.
Yeah, just I don't know. I feel like James Madison is off there.
Mm-hmm. I don't know enough about him though. Other than that, because I would think the interesting thing that the more secular classical liberals should look at is the fact that the deism of the founding fathers era really started melting away in the 19th century. Specifically, first off, more predominantly in Europe, where after Napoleon fell, in Britain especially, you had a return of traditional nominal Christianity, and deism was on a sharp decline. In America, you had the Second Great Awakening, which you had the start of the evangelical movement, and again, that was a return to traditional Christianity. And eventually, the Catholics came in with Pope Leo XIII and the round would have been considered the Third Great Awakening to address a lot of the issues of the Industrial Revolution. And the point being that the secular Thomas Paine dream of a post-Christian 19th century never really came to fruition. Of course, it came now, but I think in a way Thomas Paine would even think was horrifying.
Yeah.
But I think we can go on until 7, so about 10 more minutes. So anything else you want to talk about? So we can wrap up.
Yeah, just I guess that's the final topic is that you think there's a chance of returning to that point of time that classical liberals would have wanted? Like you think there's no point of return?
No, I would say there's no point of returning to exactly the way things were in the 18th and 19th century. History doesn't work like that. I'm not a progressive. I don't believe history automatically progresses in a good direction. Certainly, I don't even think Hegel believed that. He just believed that history was the story of just changes and different, and the dissemination of ideas. I would say that, again, if classical liberals wanted a society, if their goal, I think that's the problem, is that their goal, much like me as a traditionalist, my goal is not to make everything the way it was in 1400. My goal is to try and reinstitute certain moral structures that have existed in the West in the hopes of leading to a more moral and Christian society. I think classical liberals would probably do well to have a similar approach of don't want to make things the way they were. Try and understand why did you love that period and those people, and understand why did those ideas exist in the first place. And I would say because they existed in societies that were very, very moral and very, very Christian. And so I think in a culture war, in a cultural, as we engage in cultural discourse, if we try and strive to re-Christianize the West, which I think the West as it stands right now is its days are numbered. The whole system that we live in is going to come crashing down, I would say, within the next century, certainly. The point is, what society can be built? What society and what can be built and salvaged from our Western society that we can build after the collapse? And that's essentially the project I'm trying to undertake, is, especially now as becoming a Catholic, is trying to do what the Catholic Church tried to do in the aftermath of Rome, of trying to establish some sort of stable Christendom.
Well, that's a very interesting answer. I guess for me is that I'm just trying to figure out. I used to be an anarcho-capitalist, and I just sort of realized that that's not really practical. But
I flipped the anarcho-capitalist flag upside down, and it's now the Austrian imperial one. I never had an ANCAP flag. I have an Austrian one, but I was thinking about myself mentally of when I used to have a few. I used to be somewhat sympathetic, but then I'm like, no, I don't want to legalize child slavery.
Yeah, well, at least you don't want. At least their ideology is, well, kind of ridiculous at times, but they do make good points.
The thing is, it's like they're lucky that anarcho-capitalism it was started now rather than 115 years ago, because in the late 19th and early 20th century, people would have looked at anarchists the way we look at Muslim terrorists. Anarchists blew up they constantly were committing terrorist attacks. They murdered the president of France. They murdered one of our presidents. They killed the Tsar of Russia. There were people that they were an actual threat to society. They're not like LARPers that say, let's legalize weed and child sex.
That's I think what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to figure out why the West is definitely unique compared to other civilizations.
Jesus.
Why? Well, why you say that?
Well, I think undoubtedly Christianity. I would say the West is a combination. First off, I would say almost every civilization is distinct from another. China is very distinct from Indian, which is very distinct from Mesoamerican. I think it's trying to understand why we think that the West is the best. And I think it's because of its combination of 80% Christianity and 20% Greek philosophy.
Yes, in other words, I'm just trying to figure out is why we're able to achieve this type of market economy, how we're able to achieve this type of trust in our society. That's why I'm trying to figure out. That trust is sort of a big factor of a functioning and healthy market capitalist economy.
That's a good point of the fact that the West helped develop very high trust societies. And of course, if you can trust the person you're trading with, you're going to be much more willing to trade with them, and more trade is generally good for the economy. Yeah. And I think it's in large part, I think one thing I would argue about with the alt-right is the fact that, if they believe that the genetics affect culture, I would say culture also affects genetics, in the sense that one argument I would use, a theory I have as to why Western civilization did so well, is why it was able to produce so many talented individuals, is because of the family structure, wherein in the middle, because the West, as being Christian, under Christian sexual morals, said that you have to be monogamous, so no polygamy. And men have to stay with their wives. Marriage is for life, so you can't divorce, and you can't have incest. It led to, basically, first off, you have twice the income and twice the ability and unlike having single mothers like we have now, unfortunately, in our culture, you have twice the income, you have kids being raised by both parents, and you don't have polygamy, so you don't have polygamy, so you have you have a situation in which a lot more of the gene pool is able to reproduce, so you have a lot more genetic diversity, and you have a strong taboo against incest, which, unlike in the Middle East, where cousin marriage and polygamy were okay, you just had a lot less, I think, genetic issues in the West, outside of course, royalty, which did get really fucked up by incest.
I just figured that. I just think about I just think it's just due to like just 1,000 years of violence, kind of. Well, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, that it was just like basically heavy violence till it got to the point that this is a high trust society. Like high trust capital just takes centuries to develop.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking that as well. I mean, that could also be the fact that, I think it's an argument that Hans Hermann Hoppe argued as to why Germany had a much stronger economy than France, even though is because Germany was deunified for a lot longer, unlike France, where in France, you basically had everything became centralized in Paris, like the universities, museums, and all of that. Whereas in Germany, there was lots of competition between Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt, Cologne, Hamburg, all wanted the best, the opera houses, theaters, all of that. And you had a much more sort of dynamic culture and economy in Germany. And
that explains why the German people is very industrial.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I think you could also sort of broaden that to the West, where Europe was always very deunified. Like after Rome, every attempt to unify Europe under one banner has consistently failed. And even the EU, I think the EU is eventually going to fail. You have that compared to China, which was completely unified. So it didn't really have an internal competition with itself, other than every few centuries, a new dynasty would come in and completely collapse the old order. It's one of the reasons why weapons development became so advanced in Europe, because they were so constantly fighting each other. You had to have, better armor. We need thicker, better armor to protect against bigger and bigger weapons. And you sort of had the cycle where, thank goodness, gunpowder was introduced, because weapons and armor at the time of the late Renaissance was getting absurd. Like 100 or 150 pound full plate mail, and like these massive swords that were like 6 feet long, and these giant maces. It's like, I would think they would have been afraid to like keep pushing it further and further, where it's like, what are we going to wear? Like 500 pounds of armor and have to like attack each other with giant wrecking balls?
Oh, it'd be funny to watch.
Oh yeah. That's why it's like, you saw rapidly after the development of gunpowder that they just stopped wearing armor.
Yeah, I think that was sort of...
And so I think, the competition, I think, again, certainly the West development, it's due to a number of factors, but I think certainly 3 of them, I would say, would be the competition between nation states in Europe, the Christian and Greek sort of moral and philosophical heart, and the superior family structure in the West.
Also, like to say that I think Judaism is total cancer.
What is
Judaism?
You're wow.
Yeah, I'm not anti-Semite.
I'm just thinking that's quite. Why do I keep getting people? I'm trying to keep my streams monetized. Damn it.
Like, I didn't say anything.
I brought in the black guy, YouTube. You can't demonetize that. That's racist.
But I'm a black guy, so I don't know.
I'm thinking. I mean, I'm part Italian, so I guess I'm black as well. But I would say this is that, like, the problem of Judaism is like I would imagine the Jewish religion now is almost completely and totally different than the Judaism of the Old Testament.
I just find them to be cancer.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Professor Farnsworth. I will never escape the alt-right, even when I'm talking to a black guy.
Wait, it's not an alt-right talking point.
I know. I'm just joking, but I love that this is where we end it. I had a really good conversation. We should do it again. Thank you so much for coming on. Any last words, Mr. Bond?
Okay. The law is perverted, and we need to do everything we can to save the West from itself.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for watching. This is the end of the podcast. Have a nice day. Oh wait, stop.